those people who have made the...
And we're going to leave this recorded hearing, take you live now up to Capitol Hill, where Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is about to testify about his agency's budget priorities. He's also expected to get questions about Iran and North Korea at the Senate Appropriations subcommittee hearing. Live coverage now here on C-SPAN 3.
I'd like to welcome two new members of subcommittee staff, Catherine Jackson, Sarita Vanka. I hope I said that right. So your written testimony, Ms. Secretary, will be accepted in the record. I'll make a short opening statement, and the floor will be yours after Senator Leahy. So it's going to be really short. Your budget proposal is 21% below the FY 2019 enacted level. Ain't happening. So this is the budget. The biggest reduction is in state, is in our account. I think you've done a great job, Mike, as Secretary of State. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan 54 times. You've been there a lot. The one thing I've learned, you're never going to win this war against radical Islam by dropping bombs alone. Count me in with what Secretary Mattis said years ago. If you cut the State Department's budget, you need to buy more ammo. The best thing to do to defeat this radical ideology is invest in the lives of others. A small schoolhouse in a poor region of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, you name the location, Africa would do more damage to radical Islam than any bomb. Giving a woman a say about the future of her children is absolutely imperative to win this conflict. Developmental aid has proven to be a wise national security investment. PEPFAR alone has saved millions of young Africans from certain death, from AIDS, and the story goes on and on and on and on. I'm a pretty hawkish guy, but I believe in this account, and I really do. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think you've done a wonderful job dealing with complicated issues all over the world, giving the President sound advice. It's up to him to take it. I appreciate the President listening. Sometimes we disagree, but I've never had anyone as President of the United States reach out and talk to more people than President Trump. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not, but he's subject to changing his mind, and he has, in my view, done a very good job of being a better friend to our allies and put our enemies on notice. And Secretary Pompeo, thank you. Pompeo, thank you for the job you do, the time you spend away from your family, and I think you represent our country exceedingly well. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'll say my former neighbor when on the times of the week that I'm in Virginia. I was actually tempted to submit my opening statement from last year's hearing because very little has changed, as we see in the President's budget request. Like last year, we're still presented with damaging funding cuts. I don't see any explanation for them. We've therefore heard the same vocal opposition to this request from the private sector, from national security experts, and from a lot of Democrats and Republicans in the Congress. Mr. Secretary, on a positive note, I appreciate that you've lifted the hiring freeze at the State Department. You've begun to address the vacancies that were created before you took the job, which actually you couldn't have lifted that hiring freeze if we had accepted the President's FY19 proposal. But there's not much else that's changed. We've been asked to consider the proposed funding levels not compared to ongoing operations and programs, but to the previous year's requests, as though nothing's happened in the world since then. Those comparisons are irrelevant, and that proposal was rejected by Republicans and Democrats alike in the Congress last year. Many of the initiatives that the administration has touted, which I think are good initiatives, women's economic empowerment, the Indo-Pacific strategy, the President's touted those, but they were made possible only because we had rejected the cuts in the previous budget. We need to face the reality that not only does the request cut most of the programs highlighted by the administration as its own priorities, but with cuts totaling $11.5 billion, virtually every program funded by this subcommittee is negatively affected. And I would note that in my years in this committee, both as chairman and as vice chairman, the bill usually comes out with unanimous vote or nearly unanimous vote, but that's because you have programs like Fulbright scholarships, food security, law enforcement, countering Russian influence, reducing poverty and human trafficking, assisting refugees, empowering women. These are important programs. But the president will use slogans like America First, but the budget says the opposite. Now, the administration has highlighted support for programs like PEPFAR, as we all do. But you can't explain how if you cut PEPFAR and other programs that combat HIV/AIDS by $1.7 billion, it's one thing to say you support these programs, but then you cut it. I don't know how that advances U.S. interests. When the administration talks about having to make choices, is it a choice that benefits that is actually a choice that is what this country wants to make, knowing they'll mean countless lives lost that could have been saved? I mean, I like to think that we are in favor of saving lives, not losing them. The administration talks about preserving U.S. global leadership. So please explain more than a talking point about burden sharing, how refusing to pay our assessments at the UN, costs that we're obligated to pay, how does that enhance U.S. leadership? When the administration talks about curbing migration, explain why cutting the funds that we appropriated to address the causes of migration makes sense. And when the administration talks about standing up for American values, and rightly calls, I agree with the administration when they call Nicolas Maduro a tyrant, but then how do you explain why a dictator like Egypt's President el-Sisi, a dictator, is feted at the White House, and Russia's President Putin, North Korea's Kim Jong-un, Turkey's President Erdogan are praised as strong leaders, and the Saudi Crown Prince, who everyone knows was involved with the murder of American citizen, is treated as an indispensable friend and ally. So every year we need to have an opportunity to reassure the world that the United States, as I believe it should be, is defender of the universal rights of free expression, of free and fair elections, of applying the rule of law to the rich and powerful. But words are not enough. I've traveled a number of these places with Senator Graham. He's a good friend, and we've seen that you can't condemn some tyrants while praising others. And if you cut programs that reinforce American values, it sends the opposite message. So I hope that once again, Mr. Chairman, that the Congress can try to be the conscience of the nation, provide the funding for international diplomacy, development that we know are so important, and remembering, as you said, what Secretary Mattis said, if you're going to cut this, buy more bullets.
Thank you, Senator Leahy. The floor is yours, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you very much, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Leahy, distinguished members of the subcommittee. I won't read my entire statement, but I do have a few minutes where I want to just walk through now. 2 years of the administration, I'm now 9 days short of 1 year of my time as Secretary of State. When Trump,
the longest-serving member of the cabinet, right?
when reclaiming my times. When the Trump administration first took office, the United States of America faced a series of threats. We faced a China that wanted to spread its model of economic corruption, increase its military power, and perfect its Orwellian control of populations. We faced in Iran a revolutionary regime that wanted to dominate the Middle East and had a guaranteed pathway to nuclear weapons following a truly bad nuclear deal. We faced a Russia that had invaded Ukraine and had captured Crimea. We faced a North Korean nuclear and missile proliferation threat. We faced a terror threat that spanned continents. And we faced petty dictators in the world like Maduro in Venezuela and Assad in Syria. The Trump administration has recognized the seriousness of these challenges, and we've responded. I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about how we've approached this. We think this has truly benefited the American people and their security. First, the Trump administration sees the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. We've leveled the American people and our friends and partners about the threats that we face. This honesty has produced growing bipartisan consensus on Capitol Hill about the need to confront Chinese aggression. It produced a unanimous consensus inside of NATO that arms control agreements like the INF Treaty are worthless if only one party adheres to its terms. It produced broad international support for the brave people of Venezuela. Basing policy on reality, we recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital, and we recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. It's why the State Department designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps a terror organization on Monday. We must recognize reality. Second, we've used creative diplomacy to build coalitions to confront our enemies, because we neither can nor should do everything ourselves. We convinced our NATO allies to spend significantly more on their own defense. We rallied the Defeat ISIS coalition, a coalition of over 80 countries, to dismantle the caliphate in Iraq and in Syria. In Warsaw, we convened more than 60 countries to discuss the common threats and shared opportunities in the Middle East that included Arab and Israeli leaders talking to one another. We're getting the Middle East Strategic Alliance off the ground. We built the Indo-Pacific strategy to do a real pivot to Asia. We supported our hemispheric partners in the OAS and Lima Group as they work to support the Venezuelan people. And we forged a global coalition at the United Nations to impose the toughest ever sanctions on North Korea. Third, we're focused on outcomes. This administration promised to dismantle the ISIS caliphate, and we've done it. We promised to confront China for its trade practices and call them out on human rights violations, and we've done it. We promised to exit the Iran nuclear deal to exert pressure on Tehran to change its murderous ways. We've done that too. We're working every day to protect our citizens at home and abroad and advance American prosperity and values, and to support our allies and partners overseas. Finally, when I first became Secretary, I promised to put diplomacy at the forefront of defending U.S. national security and advancing our interests. I think I've done that too. Here's what's happened in my 11+ months. We lifted the hiring freeze for family members as well. This was a no-brainer. We brought 2,000 family members who are eligible for employment back onto our team. Promotion rates in the foreign services, which were cut in 2017 across the board by 40 or 50%, are now growing again. New foreign service officer and foreign service specialist classes are beginning. 55 senior leaders have been confirmed by the Senate since my first day. Thank you for that. More to follow, I hope. I'm holding a small group of events all across the world, including here in Washington. I call them Meet with Mike. My team can hear from me. We listen to many, many voices directly. And back in the States, I've traveled some to tell the State Department's story here in America, to convince Americans why diplomacy matters. I've also been recruiting. And at my recommendation, President and Senate recognized 4 individuals to become career ambassadors: David Hale, Phil Goldberg, Michelle Sassans, and Dan Smith. The rest of our team knows that these are people that we can all look up to. There's much more to say, but I'll end here. I look forward to discussing the administration's foreign policy and the $40 billion budget request for State Department and USAID for 2020. And with that, I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much. We'll do 6-minute rounds. Got a hard stop at 4:30. Do the math. We'll try to plow through and have some time for a second round if possible. But thank you for coming. If the committee restores the funding, if we reject the budget and go back to the last year's budget, could you spend the money wisely?
Yes.
Thank you. Outcomes. I think you're doing a great job. Morale is better. You're spending a lot of time explaining the State Department to people here at home. I think you should travel more in the United States. That's hard to ask of a guy who spends his life on an airplane, but it's really important to tell the State Department the story. I think you do it very well. Afghanistan, the outcome is peace with dignity for women in Afghanistan. Is that correct?
That's correct. Also making sure that America's counterterrorism interests are protected as well.
So we have 2 goals. Make sure that people like ISIS and Al-Qaeda types who will never come to the peace table, they do not recapture, take over Afghanistan, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And if we reintegrate the Taliban back into the Afghan community writ large, that we do so on our terms, not theirs.
That's correct.
Thank you. Syria. The stabilizing force that we're talking about will have more Europeans and our numbers will go down in terms of boots on the ground. Is that correct? Is that the proposal?
That's the discussion that's underway, yes, Senator.
Okay. Do you agree with me that having a stabilizing force is the best insurance policy against the return of ISIS?
We have to do, the President's directive, we do everything necessary to ensure that there's not an ISIS 3.0 or, frankly, that the disasters in Idlib don't befall us.
Do you agree with me that having a stabilizing force in northeastern Syria will prevent Iran from coming down and taking over the oil?
It is an important part of our overall Middle East strategy, including our counter-Iran strategy.
So containing Iran would, including having a policy in Syria that would keep them from benefiting from our withdrawal.
That's right. It's one piece of it, yes,
Okay.
Senator.
So there's a small contingent of forces down at Tanis.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. That interdicts the flow of weapons from Beirut to Tehran. Is that correct?
It also performs important counterterrorism mission as well.
Okay. So I think keeping that contingent there is a good outcome for America because we want to protect Israel against an increasingly armed Syria. When we go to Turkey, they're a NATO ally with plenty of problems. Have you told Turkey that if they deploy the S-400, they can't be part of the F-35 program?
Yes.
Okay. When it comes to Africa, are you familiar with the Fragile State report issued by the United States Institute of Peace?
I am.
In terms of outcome, do you believe that when it comes to the Sahel and other regions, you pay now or you pay later?
It is a difficult place, and I've seen legislation that has been proposed, fragile state legislation that has been proposed, and the objective there is something the State Department agrees with.
Thank you. When it comes to North Korea, the objective, the outcome is what?
The outcome is a fully, verifiably denuclearized peninsula, and greater peace, less risk in conventional means, and hopefully a brighter future for the North Korean people as well.
In Venezuela, what's the outcome?
We will continue to support democracy for the Venezuelan people, along with our partners in the region.
What's the prospect of that happening anytime soon?
I try to stay out of the prediction business.
Fair enough.
The things I can control, the efforts that we're making, I think are working in the right direction. I think we've supported the properly designated leader, Juan Guaido, in a way that has been good at helping build out what the Venezuelan people have demanded, and our partners in the region have been spectacular as well.
When it comes to Iran, the designation of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard as a terrorist organization, do you think that's justified? Obviously you do. You wouldn't have done it.
I do.
Give us 15 seconds. Why?
Continues to raise the cost for Iranian terror around the world. It recognizes a basic reality. It's a terror group. We should not forget, I had a group of a handful of folks who were held in 1979. It was originally 52 folks, 444 days. They reminded me that many of the Iranian leaders today are the very individuals that beat them, blindfolded them, handcuffed them, and the American embassy in Tehran. This is a long-time challenge pushing back against Iran, and the designation we made yesterday will further restrict their access to wealth to spread terror around the world.
Do you agree with me that of all the nation states really on the planet, Iran is near the top of the list, if not top, in terms of being destabilizing and destructive?
Absolutely.
So the outcome that we seek against Iran is what?
Laid out 12 things we asked the Iranian leadership to do, and we are supporting the Iranian people in helping to change the desires and the actions of the Iranian government.
When it comes to Israel, the outcome we seek is what?
Tell me what you're thinking there, Senator.
When it comes to Israel, what is the outcome?
They're a great partner, a great ally. They're the premier democracy in the Middle East. They are a great partner and important for American national security, and a great partner more broadly as well.
Well, thank you for the terrific job you and your folks are doing in very difficult circumstances and in dangerous places. And to me, the State Department people who are in USAID and other places are risking their lives for a noble cause. Thank you, Senator Lee.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, you were quoted in the press referring to Nicolas Maduro as a tyrant after he ordered his army to block the entry of humanitarian aid. I think you'll find every single senator here, Republican, Democrat, would agree with you. But I think we also have to be consistent if we're going to be taken seriously. Would you agree that your description of Maduro also applies to North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un?
Sure. I'm sure I've said that.
What about Egypt's President Sisi?
You know, I would not use that characterization.
Okay, even though he locked up political opponents and claimed victory after a sham election?
Yeah, Senator, there's no doubt that it's a mean, nasty world out there. But not every one of these leaders is the same. Some of them are trying to wipe entire nations off the face of the earth, and others are actually partnering with us to help keep Americans safe. There's a difference among of leaders. You might call them tyrant, you might call them authoritarian, but there's a fundamental difference, and therefore a fundamental difference in the way the United States should respond.
I just want to make sure I got it straight. Maduro's a tyrant. Kim Jong-un is a tyrant. Sisi is changing the Constitution, locking up thousands of political opponents and dissidents, trying to stay in power, holding journalists and others, but he's not a tyrant.
We have not been remotely bashful. You simply need to read the State Department's human rights report about calling out human rights violations everywhere and always. We're entirely consistent with respect to that, and we use tools at America's arsenal to push back against that wherever they can. Different tools, different places, different challenges.
Well, of course, the president calls him a great friend. Is that a tool to push back on him?
The president gets to choose his own words, how he speaks about these people. There's no doubt the Egyptians have been an important security partner, helping us take down terror threats in the Sinai that have reduced risks to the United States of America. There's no doubt about that, and for that, I'm deeply appreciative of President Sisi. He has also been remarkably good with respect to religious freedom. I had a chance to travel there, see it. He has been a remarkable beacon in the Middle East for religious freedom.
Does he do the same for press freedom?
We've called out the places where President Sisi's not treated the press in the way that are consistent with America's values. We're unabashed about that. He's here today. I met with him yesterday. We talked about these very issues yesterday, asking him to do better, asking him to, certainly with respect to Americans, do better as well.
Do you think he will?
I hope so. We certainly placed it squarely on something that we're demanding from him.
Well, I think the thousands of political opponents and dissidents he's locked up hope he'll do better.
I'm sure they do, Senator.
The career officials at OFAC determined that the Major League Baseball could enter into an agreement with the Cuban Baseball Federation so that you could have the safe entry of Cuban players into Major League Baseball, so they stopped the human trafficking of players up here. I think the final agreement was entered into under the Trump administration, but now the Trump administration has torn that up and said that they won't. What changed?
We gained additional information which made very clear that a beneficiary of these deals were people that weren't advancing democracy, weren't advancing the very human rights that I know, Senator, you're so concerned about, and we wanted to stop that. We wanted money not to go to those individuals. That's why we changed.
So are you going
new data, new facts, new policy.
Are you going to do the same with Egypt, Saudi Arabia?
We'll use every appropriate tool to try and change behavior every place we find it inconsistent with American values.
Well, let me go to one of those. Chairman Graham and I and our counterparts on the Foreign Relations Committee, I think 18 other senators, requested the president, this was last October, to make a determination on the imposition of sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act with respect to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. He's not done so, even though the Magnitsky Act explicitly requires him to. Are we in violation of that law?
No.
Why?
We are continuing to pursue facts. Just as with the other individuals that we sanctioned under Global Magnitsky, we, the United States government, sanctioned under Global Magnitsky, when we find the facts, we will apply the law appropriately. We've done so consistently during my entire time as Secretary of State.
Well, the facts, I remember, without going into classified things here, I remember coming out of one of the meetings of it, what was it? You said it wasn't a smoking gun, it was a smoking saw.
Yeah, it was pretty good.
And
it was a smoking saw.
Okay, you've applied, our law says explicitly that the Secretary of State has credible information, not proof, but credible information that a foreign official has committed a gross violation of human rights. They're ineligible to enter the United States. So you've denied entry to 16 Saudis for their involvement. If the Crown Prince ought to travel to the U.S., and you've read the same intelligence that Senator Graham and I have, would you deny him entry?
My commitment, President Trump's commitment from the first time we learned of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi is that we would apply the facts as we learn them to the law as it exists, to every place, and that we would continue to pursue the facts as well, so we got to the right answer.
Okay, but you didn't answer my question.
That's what we'll do. If he seeks to come here, that's what we'll do.
I'll submit my other questions for the record.
Absolutely.
And I hope this time when I submit questions for the record, they'll actually get answered.
I'll do my best, Senator.
Thank you, Senator.
You didn't last time, but thank you.
Thanks, Senator Leahy. Senator Moran.
Chairman, thank you. Secretary, welcome. Thank you for your service and your presence with us today. Travel with me, if you would, around the globe. Let me start with the Democratic Republic of the Congo for a home state issue. Michael Sharp was assassinated. He's was a UN worker in the Democratic Republic of Congo. He comes from Kansas. That occurred in March of 2017. There is evidence to believe that the assassination was conducted by the security forces of the previous president, Joseph Kabila. We have had, as recently as last month, conversations with the UN Secretary. I and others are dissatisfied with the UN investigation. What, if any, role has the State Department, or will the State Department play in the attempt to provide justice for Mr. Sharp's family?
So, if I may speak without talking about the particular case, but I'll tell you what we do in instances just like this one. I'm happy to give you a briefing on exactly what we've done in this particular instance, but the State Department is always involved when there's an incident like the one you described. We work with the local law enforcement, as do other elements of the United States government, to try and get the facts. Where there is a UN investigation, as you described here, we work to push the UN to get it right, and to make sure, too, that they have the resources they need in the theater, in that space, to get it right, too. We work to help them develop relationships, carry out conversations so that we can get answers for the American people, in this case, at Kansas.
Mr. Secretary, if you would, or someone at your bequest, on your behalf, visit with me about this specific case,
yes, sir.
I'd welcome
Absolutely.
that conversation. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, let's go to Saudi Arabia. We know they have detained American citizens in the past, have done so as recently as last week. This is behavior that I would put to other countries that we would find very objectionable. Would you agree that these actions are unacceptable and warrant consequences? What's the plan?
Yes, anytime someone wrongfully detains an American citizen, there has to be an American response.
And we have had that response, or that response is occurring?
I have spoken to the senior leadership in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, from the king on down, about every instance where we've found human rights abuses, wrongful detentions, or even the fact that we believe that one of those events may have occurred.
Have you seen,
and in every conversation, we continue to do that.
Mr. Secretary, have you seen any evidence of changing behavior or hope for changing behavior?
I'll give an example. The work that we were doing in Yemen to try and get a decrease in the violence in Stockholm, the Saudis were instrumental in getting that agreement completed. It was good. It created an opportunity for there to be foodstuffs and medicine that could move through the port at Hudaida. We've not yet successfully been able to implement that, but the Saudis have invested and committed resources, and the Crown Prince himself has worked to try and implement that agreement as an example of something that the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been doing to reduce violence, protect Americans, and keep us all safe.
Mr. Secretary, let's go to the Middle East. There needs to be a focus, in my view, on promoting good governance and economic opportunity in the liberated areas from ISIS, so as to deny ongoing support to the groups that would comprise ISIS. What's the current status of rebuilding those areas that were liberated from ISIS?
Senator, not much progress has been made to date, but not only the United States, but European countries and others have lined up resources to begin to do that. There's still not a whole lot of real estate in Syria where it's possible to begin to do even stabilization, let alone reconstruction. Still pretty difficult that, but our team, the State Department team, is on the ground there working to create the conditions where we can begin to do the things we need to do. First, the stabilization operations so that we can prevent the resurgence of these terror activities, both in eastern Syria and in western Iraq.
How about Egypt? The administration is, what is the administration doing to stop Egypt from purchasing Russian Su-35 jets? What sanctions, as required by law, will state implement against the Egyptians if they carry through with that purchase?
We've made clear that if those systems were to be purchased, that statute CATSA would require sanctions on the regime. We've received assurances from them that they understand that, and I'm very hopeful that they will decide not to move forward with that acquisition.
That's good to hear. Mr. Secretary, Venezuela in our own hemisphere, I assume we'll need billions of dollars in reconstruction assistance to repair its infrastructure. There's a request for authority to transfer $500 million, but I assume more money will be required. What are your expectations, and what are we doing with our friends and allies in regard to Venezuela's future?
Yes. Once we're successful at supporting Venezuelan democracy, there will be billions of dollars of investment required. The Maduro regime over coming on now years and years has destroyed the infrastructure there, including the oil infrastructure, that is their capacity to create wealth for their people. I've seen numbers that range from $10 to $50 billion worth of investment. It will come from the United States, but largely from other countries around the world too. The Europeans are anxious to participate in that. I'm convinced that each of the some 50 countries that are with Juan Guaido will participate in that. And then I'm also very hopeful that the private sector, that we'll be able to create conditions, rule of law conditions sufficient that countries will be comfortable that they won't have their equipment people nationalized yet one more time in Venezuela, and they can return to make the real investments that it will take to ultimately stand up the Venezuelan economy.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your testimony.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thought my more senior senator on my left was to be next, but I appreciate.
I got the list. I'll change it. I'm very flexible.
I appreciate walking in first. Thank you.
It was a photo finish, but we looked at the tape.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I am puzzled, however, because you talked in your opening remarks about the threat from China, and you also talked about the importance of diplomacy, which I very much appreciate. I think, as you point out, you have refocused on the importance of our State Department employees and the great work that our American diplomats do around the world. And yet, the State Department's proposed budget, as the chairman has pointed out, requests the largest drop for any cabinet department by total dollars, and by percentage, it's 24%. And yet, at the same time, we have seen over a period of the last few years an increase in the Chinese diplomatic budget. So from 2011 to 2017, China nearly doubled its budget. I know you know these numbers. Their spending increased by 12.3% in 2018. Just last month, before the Chinese parliament, Beijing presented a budget for 2019 that would increase foreign affairs spending by another 7.4%. American diplomats are already outnumbered 5-to-1 by Chinese diplomats doing economic and commercial work in Africa and elsewhere, and we hear from ambassadors of many of these countries who say to members of Congress they'd rather do business with the U.S., but they can't find us. So I just wonder if you can talk about how this soft power dynamic is influencing our ability to win our competition with China.
So it is the case that the Chinese use multiple tools of soft power. Their diplomats are a small part of that. But they don't as neatly separate their private sector from their diplomatic sector, frankly, for that matter, from their military as well. And if you looked at the resources they're providing to the military, you would see numbers that were similarly aggressive or demonstrated aggressiveness around the world. And then you'd see investment, places like Africa, Asia, South Asia, places that you might not have expected them. The administration has taken this threat seriously. I'll be honest, we're late. America's late. I think Europe was late to recognize this threat too, but we are now very focused on this, and I don't want to take up a lot of time, but we have a number of programs, including the BUILD Act that was passed last year, that I am convinced will begin to turn the corner.
Thank you,
but
Mr.
it's going to take
Secretary.
determination.
I don't want to interrupt, but I appreciate that. I'm on the committee, so I know that we passed the BUILD Act. But I guess what I'm trying to reconcile here is the commitment that you say exists, and yet it's not reflected in the budget request for the State Department. So I think this committee feels differently about the need to support diplomacy and the State Department budget, and I hope, as you said to the chairman, that you will make good use of whatever dollars that we fund. I want to switch topics, if I can, to the expansion of the Mexico City policy. I know that you and I disagree about women's reproductive rights, but I thought we agreed about the importance of ensuring that people could get access to health care. And yet, what we've seen from the expansion of this Mexico City policy, where we have reports about the impact, is a real negative impact on maternal health, on families. We have, according to the Marie Stopes International, they currently have a funding gap of $50 million as a direct result of this policy, and that translates to 1.4 million fewer women with access to contraception services, 600,000 more unsafe abortions, 4,600 avoidable maternal deaths. The Mozambican Association for Family Development will lose 60% of its budget next year. 10 of its 20 health clinics will close, and 30% of its staff will be laid off. In Swaziland, the group has lost a quarter of its funding, and as a result is now only able to serve 4 towns out of 14. In Botswana, 60% of funding is under threat, and while 1 clinic has already closed, 7 others have scaled back to a bare minimum. So in fact, despite some of the previous testimony that I've seen, the data is unmistakable. This is having a huge impact on the health of women and families around the world. And so how can, I mean, I think we can all agree that we want to ensure that the United States policies support health care for people in this country, and yet this policy is undermining that for women. Can you justify why you think this is, in fact, helping and not hurting?
Senator, the policies that I announced now a couple of weeks back don't reduce funding for health care by a single dollar. Not $1. There was not a budgetary announcement in there. Every single dollar that was program spent, appropriated, will continue to be program spent and appropriated. What I was seeking to do was close loopholes in the policy that were permitting end runs around the Mexico City policy that prevents taxpayer dollars from going to abortion-related services. That's the mission set, while doing so in a way that preserves all of the resources that are there for health care.
But in fact, that hasn't been the outcome. And as you point out, you are, as the Secretary of State, focused on outcomes, and the outcomes of this expanded policy is very clear. It's shown up in every independent study that has looked at what the impact of the policy is. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Secretary, for being here. Let's go back to Venezuela a little bit and talk about impact on Colombia. Probably in Colombia, the 2 biggest problems right now would be refugees and economic impact of those refugees, and the increased production of coca and drugs. So let's talk about that a little bit, and if you want to work that into what we're hoping to do with Peace Colombia, I'd like to hear what those dollar figures might look like on Peace Colombia as well.
So, Senator, the challenges in Venezuela are absolutely moving their way in and through Colombia. It originally began as a border set of issues and now have moved even further. You identified the cost of the folks who have fled Venezuela now some 3 million, so 10% of the population of Venezuela. Our best analysis says there'll be another 2 to 2.5 million people flee during calendar year 2019, a big burden on Colombia. It also makes issues of keeping security at the border more difficult. So groups like the ELN, the remnants of the FARC, now having more people who are subject to their influence. And then lastly, it's very difficult for counter-narcotics. As these folks come across, it makes the Colombian burden even that much greater. And so our efforts in Colombia to support President Duque, I'll actually be there on Sunday of this week to go visit, are things we are going to have to revisit as this problem continues to grow. We think we have enough money in the budget to help the Colombians with the things they can actually achieve throughput on during this fiscal year. But it could be, if there continues to be an increase in the number of people leaving Venezuela for Colombia, that problem increases and we might need more resources. It's possible.
Well, I think we need to watch that closely, and there's a point here to where if you're going to reverse what's happened in the last couple of years and the increased drug trade and poppy growth, the opioid poppy growth, it's a moment where we need to be committed financially as well as with our other resources. Colombia, in many ways, is important to us in South America as maybe Jordan is in the Middle East. I think there's a lot of similarity between they can do things that we would do better than we do them in both cases because they're doing what we'd like to do instead of us being in there giving the directions. And so the other refugee, what are we doing with State Department programs to help with the Syrian refugee problem, particularly as it relates to Jordan?
So you have significant refugees remaining still in Turkey and in Lebanon, as well as in Jordan. We're working with the Jordanians to try to create situations on the ground in Syria in certain pockets where there can be a safe and voluntary return. We're only a fraction of the way along the way in being able to actually demonstrate that at a volume that matters to the Jordanians. In the interim, we're providing resources and participating in forums where the Arab states are also contributing significantly to ensuring that Jordan has the resources to take care of those refugees in what is now a multi-year problem. You've got kids who were born in some of those camps who are now, by American standards, in kindergarten age.
What about Lebanon and Turkey? The same issue?
Same set of issues. Each of them has treated the refugees slightly differently, has chosen different approaches. There aren't big camps in Lebanon in the same way there are inside of Jordan. They've dispersed throughout Turkey as well, but each of those three countries has borne an enormous burden from the conflict in Syria.
What are you doing in this budget for embassy security?
We think the number that we've proposed is more than adequate for embassy security.
How does it compare to the number we appropriated last year?
I don't recall. I'd have to go get that number for you. I don't know the number.
Maybe somebody back there has that number while we go to one other issue. While they're looking for that, and I'd like to know this number, this year's proposal versus last year's number. And on the religious freedom issues, Ambassador Brownback has taken an aggressive role there and in a broad view of the world in his travels and his efforts.
He has. We've been working on this all across the world. We've been speaking out recently about the challenges in China to religious freedom, not just the Uyghurs, but even more broadly than that. The absence of religious freedom there is of historic proportions.
And I think Ambassador Brownback really has taken a position on religious freedom versus just the more narrow freedom to worship in these countries where allow freedom to worship but don't allow people to express their religion beyond that. And I think that's an important thing for him to do. I don't know if you've got a number there behind you or not, but I think—
Doesn't look like I do just yet.
Increasingly looking at our embassies, we've been doing that for over 20 years now, trying to make them more secure. I think also more concern about security of people, where people live that work in the embassies that are U.S. citizens and part of the State Department family. Anything you want to say about that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
Just also the concerns of people who are living in countries that we're concerned about in that part of the State Department family.
Yeah, so we've done a handful of things during my 11 months to put in place programs that will improve lives on some disability issues for our officers who have disabilities. It's proven a challenge in some of the places around the world. I think we're in a better place today. You all have been very generous in providing the resources for us to be able to do that. And each time I go to an embassy, I have a chance to get down and talk one-on-one with embassy officers, and I always ask them, how are the schools? How are the medical facilities here? Do you have the ability to get to your place of worship? And for the most part, we're in very, very good shape. Some of them are just very difficult places to serve, and we have shorter time on station as a result of that. I do have the number for you, Senator. This is for what we list as worldwide security protection FY20 requests versus 2018 enacted. The change is up 0.6%, and from FY 2020 requests to the FY 2019 respect, up 2.2%.
I want to talk more about that later. Chairman, I think I'm out of time right now.
Thank you, Senator Durbin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being
Yes,
here.
sir.
Last year at this time, I was in Caracas, my only visit to Venezuela, meeting with Maduro and Juan Guaido, coincidentally, during the course of that trip. Little did I realize at the time what 12 months would mean in terms of Venezuela. I saw firsthand, and you have undoubtedly heard credible reports, how miserable life is for the Venezuelans. They face basic deprivations of food and medicine and things that we take for granted. And the political situation has become much more volatile there. It's my understanding that Cubans have been sending in security forces to support the Maduro regime. I'm also told the Russians have sent in some type of new group, such as we saw in eastern Ukraine, to play some role in support of Maduro. It is not a healthy situation. Juan Guaido's wife came to see me last week, and I believe she also met with the president, talked about the danger to her husband and those who supported him. That was very clear. So that's why I joined with Marco Rubio about 2 weeks ago in sending a letter to you and the president saying this is a time to protect Venezuelans who are here in the United States. They should not be forced to return to the dangerous conditions in Venezuela. They should be given temporary protected status. I've yet to hear. Can you announce today the good news that these Venezuelans can stay here in the United States?
I cannot.
Why?
We are still evaluating how to handle that situation. There's no decision been made by the administration yet.
I don't get this. It is so dangerous the United States has intervened on a foreign policy basis. We have made it clear we have no use for Maduro, and we believe the Venezuelan people suffer under his leadership. I just sense, Mr. Secretary, that this president's aversion to refugees and immigrants is stopping him from doing the obvious. Come to the rescue of Venezuelans in the United States on a temporary basis. Don't force them back into a dangerous, deadly situation. Is there any other explanation you can think of?
I think this administration has done more for the Venezuelan people than the previous administrations combined.
Well, how about the ones who are
I'm
here?
very proud of what we've done. So I think to suggest we've shortchanged the Venezuelan people is inconsistent with our activities.
Well, you should come to my office and meet with the Venezuelans who are here with their visas expiring. Perhaps you could see there's more we could do that is not a great problem. And for the record, we're not full. America's not full. We have room for these Venezuelans and others who desperately need the United States at this moment in their history. Let me ask you the question. I just was handed a note that the OAS voted 18-9 to recognize Guaido's representative as Venezuela's ambassador to the OAS. So the OAS, though they're not always in your good favor, I hope you think positively of them at this moment. Do you believe that we should have a two-state solution in the Middle East?
The administration will roll out the plan that Mr. Kushner and Mr. Greenblatt have been working on before too long, and you will see President Trump's vision for how to resolve a problem that's been going on for decades and decades that previous administrations couldn't solve. We are hopeful that we have some ideas that are different, unique, which will allow the Israelis and the Palestinian people to come to a resolution of their conflict.
Draw a historic parallel for me between the decision to say to Israel that they could claim sovereignty over the Golan Heights, a territory that was seized during the 1967 war from Syria, and the Russian claims that they can claim Crimea because they happen to invade it as well.
Senator, the two situations could not be more starkly different.
I'd like to hear.
The Golan Heights was, the Israelis ended up with the Golan Heights as result of having been attacked. They were on the defense. They were at risk of their very nation being overrun during the Battle of the Valley of Tears, and they defended themselves. And they retained that terrain to continue to defend themselves from the murderous regimes in Syria. Russia, on the other hand, wasn't on the defensive. Russia chose at their own moment in time to go seize land from a people that posed no threat to them whatsoever.
So our diplomatic position is that land seized in the course of war is then the spoils for those who happen to occupy it.
I'll say two things about that. So there's international law doctrine on this very point. We don't have time to begin to go through it today, but I'm happy to have a team go over and walk you through that element of international law. But the second thing is just a practical policy matter. If it's the case that there is absolutely no cost for aggression, that is, if you attack and you have some of your land taken as a result of an attack that you undertook and you get it back just because you didn't succeed, that's a bad incentive system to set up.
So we could claim Iraq, I guess, under that theory.
We could probably go through dozens and dozens of examples. You asked me to compare and contrast the situation in the Golan Heights in Crimea.
Mr. Secretary, I strongly support our relationship with Israel. I believe the Palestinians need a homeland as well. Two sovereign states, not a threat to one another. And this departure that we've made under this administration, I'm afraid, puts the future of Israel as a Jewish democracy in doubt. I don't think the administration is thinking clearly about how this ends well. Perhaps the people of Israel in this election today will see a different way in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Daines.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Pompeo, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
And I want to thank you for being here today. I want to thank you and the administration for your unwavering support of Israel. It is much appreciated. Secretary Pompeo, I want to shift gears and talk about China for a moment. As you know, I spent over 5 years living there as an expat for Procter & Gamble. I had 2 kids born in Hong Kong, in fact, back in the 90s. I've led multiple Codels. I had to visit China and its neighbors and continue to see China's growing regional and global influence. It's very apparent. I believe it's critically important that we as a nation are clear-eyed about the challenges as well as the opportunities that the U.S.-China relationship brings. We cannot just view these ongoing negotiations solely through an economic lens as a standard trade dispute. It is imperative we keep in mind China's strategic approach and their long-term goal of becoming the world's superpower. Secretary Pompeo, as you know, China has developed an advanced innovation ecosystem. It's remarkable, truly. I led a group of 5 senators last year. We saw companies in Shenzhen and Hangzhou, the Alibabas, the Tencent, JD.com, and so forth. They're becoming globally competitive in critical technologies like AI, biotechnology, quantum computing, 5G, and others. This comes with risks, both our national security as well as our economic well-being. With the latest findings of the UK's National Cybersecurity Center about the significant issues Huawei can cause for the telecom industry, the world is starting to acknowledge the risks this administration has been stating for months. Despite these clear risks, some of our allies, including France, Germany, and potentially even the UK, continue testing and moving towards installing Huawei equipment. My question, Mr. Secretary, how does the U.S. plan to mitigate the risk of working with countries that continue to deploy Huawei technology in their 5G infrastructure?
So while it's fairly technical, I'll summarize. Our security leaders don't believe there's a technical mitigation technique that's available today. That is, we may solve the riddle, but the risks of having equipment network systems co-located with Huawei systems, other Chinese systems, is a very, very difficult technical problem. So our solution to mitigating that risk will be not to co-locate or not to share American information with countries that choose to put this technology in their systems, knowing that the risk that it will wander to China's government is too great. And so America will have to choose another method. We won't be able to share information or participate along with some of our important national security partners if they choose to go down this path of installing this technology.
Secretary, I want to shift gears and talk about religious freedom for a moment. Religious freedom is a fundamental human right. And whether it's China's pervasive surveillance, the destruction of thousands of churches and mosques, or the detention of hundreds of thousands in re-education camps with the Uyghurs out in Xinjiang province and indefinite detentions, it's critically important that we as a nation founded on freedom, the rule of law, bring our influence to bear to advance human rights in China and around the world. You've stated that China, and I quote, is a league of its own when it comes to human rights violations. What work is your administration actively doing to help protect the human rights of the Uyghur people, ensuring this is a priority in any ongoing discussions with the Chinese government?
So it is in a league of its own. The work that began in Tibet, now being perfected in Xinjiang, is Orwellian in nature. And our efforts are diplomatic. That is, we identify this as something that the Chinese can't continue to do. I had a group of Uyghurs in my office, and it's probably been 2 weeks ago now. Indeed, just after they came, an aunt and uncle of one of the young men had visited me was approached by the Chinese government, I'm sure now to worse conditions than they were in before. He'd had a meeting with the United States Secretary of State. Our whole team, all across the world, is very focused on this issue in China.
Speaking of going around the world, as you know, Turkey has become one of the few Muslim-majority countries to condemn China's treatment of the Uyghurs. What work has been done to build a coalition to raise and address these human rights violations in Xinjiang province, particularly with Muslim-majority nations around the world?
Not enough yet. There's a great deal more work to do. I am very hopeful that we will get an increased number of Muslim nations who share our view that this is a gross violation of the human rights of Muslims in China, and they will begin to work in the same way we are working to convince the Chinese not to continue these practices. There's a lot more work to do there, Senator.
In my view, there's probably only so much we can do unilaterally as it relates to confronting the challenges that we see in China. And I think it's critical we work with our allies and China's neighbors in the region to mitigate China's malign actions, whether it be in the South China Sea, human rights, or ongoing unfair trade practices. As you think about some of your strategic goals in engaging with allies in the Indo-Pacific region to proactively counter Chinese efforts to expand its influence, tell me how you think about that right now with our allies there in that part of the world.
So I actually think this is the place we have made progress. I think the first challenge has always been to identify the threat, to make clear to them. Sometimes we had information that was important to share with them about risk. Sometimes they had information to share with us about risk as well. So I think pooling understandings of the threat has been important. I think that has now been socialized in significant ways. And you now see partners. You see partners in Australia. You see partners in Vietnam. You see work that's done throughout other parts of Southeast Asia, countries that understand this threat. And I think that threat is also beginning to be identified in other places too. African nations where China is active, Middle Eastern countries where China is moving out full force. Our Indo-Pacific strategy, I am convinced, will raise the cost for this Chinese malign activity.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to thank you, too, when you listed all the outcomes, the accomplishments of this administration and your leadership. I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator.
Senator Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Hello, sir.
And I want to associate myself with the remarks the chairman made with respect to the foreign affairs budget at the beginning of the hearing. I have to beg to differ with you on the president's meeting with El-Sisi. The president walked out of that meeting and said, quote, I can tell you he's doing a great job. You indicated that part of your responsibilities as Secretary of State was to, quote, work to protect American citizens abroad. I just want to say I don't think anybody that's detaining and putting in prison 20 American citizens is doing a great job. Let me ask you about Turkey and the F-35s. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Scaparotti, said recently, quote, if the Russians get the S-400, quote, it's his best military advice that we don't then follow through with the F-35s. As I understood your response to the chairman, the clear and resolute position of the administration is if Turkey gets delivery of the S-400s, it will not get delivery of the F-35s. Is that correct?
I have communicated that to them both privately, and I will do so again publicly right here.
Thank you. Would you agree also that if they go through with that $2.5 billion transaction, which is what the S-400 purchase amounts to, that would trigger the significant transaction requirements in the CATSA legislation and require the imposition of sanctions on Turkey?
If I can avoid making a legal conclusion, that's a very significant transaction.
I thank you. So I want to follow up on Senator Durbin's questioning. And you would agree that you can be pro-American if you don't agree with all the policies of the Trump administration, right?
Yes, sir.
And you can be pro-Israel, and there's a bipartisan pro-Israel sentiment in this Congress, if you don't agree with all the policies of the Netanyahu government.
Critiquing a policy that Israel undertakes is part of our democratic process.
And we have a democratic process, too, and we disagree with the president, and that still makes us good Americans. So let me ask you this. Is it still the policy of the United States to oppose Israel's unilateral annexation of any or all of the West Bank?
Yeah, here's what I can say. I'll give the same answer I gave to Senator Durbin. We are in the process of laying down our vision for how to resolve a problem that is.
So, Mr. Secretary, if I could ask you, I asked about unilateral annexation. So that by itself indicates no agreement with the Palestinians. So my question is, it sounds like you've already abandoned what has been a bipartisan foreign policy of opposing the annexation of any or part of the West Bank by Israel. Is that what you're telling us today?
I think we've seen, I think it was Senator Durbin that critiqued our decision on the Golan, where he would characterize that.
I'm not asking you about the Golan right now.
Right.
I'm asking you about the West Bank.
And I'm telling you, you will see our proposal.
The polls are closing right now in Israel. And things could move very quickly. And as you know, the Prime Minister as a candidate said he would annex all or part of the West Bank. He said settlements, and then he said including outposts. And today you cannot tell us what U.S. policy is on this issue.
Yeah, again, I think I've answered the question as I'm going to answer the question.
All right. Do you agree that Palestinians should be extended basic human rights?
Yes, of course. Our proposal will absolutely have as one of its core undertakings making life better for the people that live in Gaza and in the West Bank.
And so if you had a one-state solution, since you haven't affirmed support for a two-state solution, would you agree that in a one-state solution, Palestinians should have full and equal political and legal rights with other citizens of that state?
I'm not going to engage in this conversation. Ultimately, the Israelis and the Palestinians will decide how to resolve this. We'll propose our administration.
You just talked about we were expecting the deal of the century, and you said the Israelis and Palestinians would have to agree.
That's right.
Okay. So I asked you about unilateral annexation. That means there's no agreement. And you can't tell me today whether that's something you support, even though that is, as you know, compromising the ability to have a two-state solution, which, as you know, let me ask you this. Do you think you can preserve a state that is Jewish and democratic and observes the rights of all its citizens without a two-state solution?
Senator, you're trying to get us to lay down what our proposal is going to be.
I'm trying to ask you about what our policy is today, Mr. Secretary.
Which will be America's policy on these very issues. You've seen our policy to date. We made the decision that I think, well, I don't know how many were out, but who voted for the move the embassy to Jerusalem. Finally, President Trump did it.
Yeah.
Right?
Which would, of course, been part, as you know, Mr. Secretary, would have been part of any final agreement, and you didn't get anything in exchange with respect to the goals of U.S. policy. Presidents Bush, Presidents Clinton, both Bushes, Obama. So let me ask you this. Do you think it advances the peace process to cut off all humanitarian assistance to the Palestinians?
You should note that...
Do you think it advances the peace process to cut off all...
May I answer your question,
sure.
Sir?
Yeah.
Senator, you should note that each of the presidents you identified didn't solve this problem.
Yeah, they did.
So whatever policies they chose failed.
I understand, and a unilateral solution is not going to do it. I would just leave you, Mr. Secretary, with the example of Turkish occupation of northern Cyprus, where Turkey would argue that they came in to help the Turkish Cypriots at the time, and Mr. Erdogan is going to love what you're saying about the ability to take lands
that were occupied through force. It is a dangerous and slippery slope, and when it comes to the West Bank, it will undermine any effort of a peaceful two-state solution.
Senator Lankford.
Secretary, great to see you. Thanks for all the work. You've been across a lot of miles for a while and had a lot of meetings and conversations. So thanks for continuing the work.
Yes, sir.
Can we shift to Central America for a moment, which is exceptionally important to us, not only in this hemisphere and economically with our trade there, but we're finding out rapidly with immigration. You go back to 4 years ago, Joe Biden started leading an effort called the Alliance for Prosperity to greatly accelerate investment into Central America. It was my impression after the first year, 4 years ago, that once the State Department pushed out funds, they seemed to just push out funds to as many federal entities as we had in Central America to get the money out the door, but it didn't seem to be very strategic. There seemed to be some learning from that after that. And then the third year of it, it still seemed to be forcing money out the door rather than being as strategic as it could be. The administration now has said we're going to try to end foreign assistance, and then it became we're going to review foreign assistance. But I just want to be able to ask for some clarification of purposeful of this. It seems to me the Alliance for Prosperity was very focused in on how do we help develop security, economics improve an area where there's stability and safety, and ending government corruption in that zone to be able to help with whatever we could with mayors and police chiefs and military leaders to be able to help in that corruption. Give me a quick update of where we're headed on the Alliance for Prosperity and Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador in specific.
Senator, the president concluded, and this is something that I saw when I was in my previous role as well as the director of the CIA. The president concluded, I think in the same way you just described, that these resources weren't very effective, that they may well have been thought out, but they just weren't getting the outcomes.
Right.
I don't know.
It was tough for us to even get metrics at all.
I think that remained the case even for the last year as well. So the first year of this administration too, the president seeing that, and then combined with the challenge of we have not yet been able to convince El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras to take seriously this need to control their own borders and to keep their people from moving into Mexico and ultimately across our southern border, that we should stop, take a time out. We've done that. So we have ceased allocating new funds inside of those three countries, and we will present to each of those three countries a set of requirements. These are the things that are expectations that the United States needs for America's interest. We think also in every case will be in their own best interest as well. And when we get to that point, we will return to considering whether and how much and under what means and what tools we will use to restart the providing of assistance to each of those three countries in the Northern Triangle.
Okay, they've been tremendous partners with us in interdicting drugs in the past, and obviously they have a real willingness to do that because that builds corruption in their own government and their own system as those drugs pass through from South America through Central America and come north. Are we continuing to be able to help them and to help them protect us from some of the incoming drugs?
Senator, it's been hit and miss. In places it has worked. I don't mean to suggest there was nothing that came from this, that it was entirely wasted, but it certainly wasn't the case that there were good metrics, and I'm convinced we can be more effective.
Okay. We look forward to being working together on that to be able to help fix that because we need both them as partners and we need to be able to help them actually step up and engage in the areas that are essential. We want them to be solid economic traders in the days ahead on it. You've made some recent comments on Assad in Syria. As I visited with some of the refugees in Lebanon a few weeks ago, it was pretty clear from the refugees that I talked to there, they're not going to return until Assad is gone because they are concerned that their children will be conscripted into his army and they will never see them again. And so they're more concerned about Assad than they are of ISIS. How do we help this in the days ahead with what's happening as more and more Arab countries are starting to back channel in diplomatic relationships with Assad and to try to reestablish diplomatic connections there to be able to help manage what's going on there and to still have Assad not as the leader because millions of people won't return if he is?
So it's a challenge. Let me just step back half a step. So Assad's there. It is the case he still controls just a fraction of his own country. and there is no clear means by which he will achieve anything other than pariah state status, certainly from the United States or Europe. So our effort has been to engage in a political process where there can be a path forward for return to something akin to democracy in Syria under the UN resolution. So that's what Ambassador Jeffries is engaged in each and every day. As for the refugees, I can't remember if I was there just before you or just after you in Lebanon. I saw the same thing. The Lebanese government is struggling mightily to continue to school, educate these refugees and to take care of them, to house and clothe them. But I heard the same thing. If we're looking for safe, voluntary return, we're not yet in a position where we can deliver that for several million refugees, not only the 1.5 million there in Lebanon, but those in Jordan and Turkey as well. I can't tell you we have a clear path forward other than the political process that the Iranians and the Russians continue to foil.
Right. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and Germany, do you have any progress report on that? Is Germany still continuing to lean forward into buying their gas from Russia?
They are.
One last comment is on Burma. Burma has been an ongoing issue for a while. We've listed them as a country of particular concern. Thank you for your work on religious liberty and continue to be able to focus in on that. That is a growing genocide that has happened there for quite a while. How is state engaging in trying to be able to bring some kind of stability to Burma or to be able to help?
So our team on the ground is applying pressure every place that we can. I met with my Bangladeshi counterpart, a huge challenge for the country of Bangladesh. There's no quick-term fix for that. I don't know if you've ever traveled to Cox's Bazar. This is going to be a years-long challenge. We are also not only using the potential carrots in Burma, but also making clear to them that the things that America is doing for them could stop. And they continue to need our support. And I'm hopeful we can move them in a better direction, not only with respect to religious liberty, but restoring basic freedoms to their people.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Secretary.
Senator Coons.
Thank you, Chairman Graham, Ranking Member Leahy, for this hearing, and thank you, Secretary Pompeo, for your testimony, your service, and congratulations on being a day away from a year, if I heard your opening correctly.
A few more than that, the 26th.
I agree with many of my colleagues, the Chairman, as well as others, that I think the proposed cuts in the President's budget would handicap America's ability to secure our interests at a time of unprecedented challenges. I broadly agree with your identification of the threats and challenges we face. In some cases, we have differences in strategy, in others we don't. But I am fairly certain that a 24% cut to the 150 account overall would not help us meet these challenges. I don't believe in spending for spending's sake, but I think investing in development, diplomacy, and humanitarian aid can actually save us money in the future. This February, the United States Institute of Peace task force, commissioned by this panel with Senator Graham's leadership, published a final report of strategies to prevent fragile states from becoming failed states. They consulted closely with the Department of State, Department of Defense, USAID, and its recommendations include a new coordinated government-wide strategy and an innovative funding system with metrics, with required performance metrics. And I think it underscores the need for targeted development and diplomacy assistance in addition to security to address the root causes of fragility in places like the Northern Triangle that we've talked about, like the Sahel. Senators Graham, Merkley, Young, Rubio, and I have introduced the Global Fragility Act. I was pleased to hear you say that we could count on your support to pass that. I'd be interested in hearing from you if you think this is the right strategy to allow us to act and think more strategically about preventing fragile states from becoming failed states, and if a coordinated investment strategy across development, diplomacy, defense is the right way to go in trying to learn from the last 18 years and the $6 trillion we've invested in combating extremism.
I do think that strategy is right. I can't say I read the whole report. I read the executive summary.
It makes for pretty compelling reading.
It does make it's compelling reading, both in that it's the right plan and it is the most cost-effective way to tackle this problem as well, which I think you referred to as.
I look forward to working with you on that. In the last Congress, the BUILD Act created a new 21st Century Development Finance Agency, China is going to be holding its annual Belt and Road Conference in Beijing next month, where it'll highlight more press announcements of massive investment. I think the reality of Chinese investment in infrastructure to secure both strategic advantage and economic opportunity is not as rosy as they portray it. I think a number of our allies and of their potential partners are learning that there are hidden costs and hidden challenges to Chinese investment. As the Secretary of State, you're the chairperson of the new Development Finance Corporation, and I was pleased to see the budget request say you would rely on this new agency to help add to Prosper Africa, the Indo-Pacific strategy, countering Russian malign influence, the Women's Global Development and Prosperity Initiative. Could you just share for a few minutes how you plan to use this new agency as a tool of U.S. foreign policy, and how the BUILD Act and our partnering with our key allies in development finance projects could provide an American-facing or an American values-based alternative to China's Belt and Road Initiative?
Senator, I think you actually captured the most important element of this, is that it's not America trying to do this with just taxpayer dollars. We have private sector partners and international allies and partners. They are very excited about this throughout parts of the world. I think you mentioned Prosper Africa as part of this as well. Perhaps you didn't, but there are many places where I think the Development Finance Corporation will ultimately deliver real outcomes to counter what China's doing. We are still almost certain to show up with fewer dollars every time than they'll show up with, and the terms of our deal from just a pure economic perspective probably won't compete. But your point about the Belt and Road Initiative not wearing well over time, and the increased understanding in countries all around the world of the risks associated with taking this Chinese financing or these Chinese projects is ever increasing. And so I think our effort there with the DFC and the BUILD Act is very timely, and I'm convinced we'll have real successes as a result of it.
Yeah, I'm excited to work with you on it. I think it's a new tool that really has a great promise, and I recently spoke to Ambassador Haggerty in Japan. I think it is a way in particular in the Indo-Pacific for us to partner with some of our key allies and to strengthen those alliances. I have just a few quick points, if I could. I agree strongly that we should have a force in Syria to contain Iran. I recognize the President has focused on ending the caliphate on the ground, but I was encouraged by your comment about a direction to prevent ISIS 3.0 from rising. But I frankly see independent value in preventing Iran from gaining, sustaining, holding, and expanding a role in Syria, and I think that is well worth our continued engagement at Al-Tanf and elsewhere. I agree with Senator Shaheen. I have real concern about the Mexico City policy expansion and its actual negative impact, and I'd love to work with you on making sure that impact on maternal and child health is not large and negative. That's something I've spent a lot of time on, in particular in Africa, and I think there's a gap between closing loopholes and having a real impact on maternal and child health we could work on. PRM, my understanding is, directed the closing of the only refugee resettlement site in Delaware, a faith-based organization that had done a lot of good work, and I'd love to review that with you at some point. Let me close with 3 quick thoughts about some concerns in Africa. I'm sorry. I also wanted to mention, I agree with expanding investment in the Indo-Pacific and was encouraged to see a 90% increase over FY19, $1.8 billion in economic and security assistance for the Indo-Pacific strategy. I thought that was encouraging and would frankly like to work on that. There is right now in Sudan an impressive, widespread, ongoing, largely peaceful protest against one of the longest standing strongmen in Africa. And I hope that in countries like Algeria and Sudan, just as we are in Venezuela, that we will find appropriate ways to encourage peaceful transitions of power. Last, I am concerned about Cyclone Idai and its impact on Mozambique and Zimbabwe. They are making real progress in combating both hunger and cholera with help from USAID and the State Department, but I just want to urge you to not let that one slip off the very large radar screen of threats we all have to take into account. I think the region is looking to whether or not the United States continues to be the sort of leading humanitarian relief partner that they have long counted on us to be.
Senator, I think I agree with everything you said there. I'd add as challenges that are there today and emerging in Africa, the Ebola outbreak is continuing, and it is something that USAID and World Health Organization and other elements of the USG as well are continuing to be very, very focused on. It's a difficult situation. The security situation there is a real challenge, but it's something that the world, I don't think, has focused on significantly, and the numbers I see each week don't show that we have our arms around it yet.
They're going in the wrong direction. If we did not have a vaccine, this would already be dramatically out of control. So we have learned from the last big outbreak, invested in vaccine, but you're right, that I agree with you. That is one of the most concerning developments on the continent, and I look forward to hearing more from you and to working in partnership with the chairman to try and tackle that. Forgive me for going over my time. Thank you for your answers.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for spending so much time with us today. A couple quick comments and then try to squeeze in a few questions. Let me associate myself with the comments that have been made already about this budget. Listen, I think it's bananas. I think there's celebration happening in Beijing and Moscow every time that we telegraph our withdrawal from the world. I don't know that this budget is the one you would write, Mr. Secretary, but cutting democracy aid by 50%, cutting exchange programs by 50%, global health programs by $2 billion, just provides this increasing vacuum for others to fill. And then my second point is on this, I think, interesting exchange you had with Senator Van Hollen about the upcoming plan that the administration is going to present. I think that that would be a satisfactory answer if we were in April of 2017, but we aren't. We're in April of 2019, and the idea that the world doesn't know 2.5 years into this administration whether America still stands for a two-state solution or we still stand against the unilateral annexation of the West Bank is what makes people's heads spin. And so I get that you're not going to go any further in your answer, but we aren't 3 months into the administration. We're 2 years and 3 months into the administration, and that is in part what drives a lot of uncertainty in the region about where America stands, and so I will just leave it at that. On a subject that maybe we can find some agreement on, I just came back from Belfast and Dublin, and we may disagree on the right prescription for Britain moving forward with respect to whether or not they stay in the European Union, but we likely don't disagree on the importance of protecting the Good Friday Agreement, and there is great uncertainty as to what the impact of Brexit would be on the ability to keep that agreement together. It seems like a moment when we should be standing up, Republicans and Democrats, and telling our friends in London that whatever they do, they need to recognize the existing fragility of peace in Northern Ireland and the importance of protecting that peace process no matter how this agreement with the European Union turns out. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
You did find a place we agree. I didn't make light of it. It's an incredibly important agreement, one that has been proven very effective and one that needs to be sustained.
Second, I want to thank you for the investment you've made in the beginnings of peace negotiations in Yemen. You and I have talked about this. And we've also talked about when the right moment is for the United States to play a more active, regular role. I think there's a sense in the region that Secretary Mattis was engaged in a daily basis. I have great respect for the UN envoy, but it seems as we're having trouble keeping the Stockholm Agreement together that it's time for the United States to play a leadership role in maybe a way that we have thus far outsourced to the UN. Your thoughts on whether it's time for a change in U.S. leadership in this process?
We might disagree about this. I think we've played a very constructive role. I suppose we could disagree about whether that's a leadership role, and I certainly think that it has. There's places we're best fit for purpose to achieve the outcome that I think you and I share as our desired end state there. And there's places that we're probably not the best face to put in front of that. We've tried to weigh in where it was and stay out where it isn't. I'm very worried about the Stockholm Agreement. I spoke with the UN envoy, it's been 3 days ago now. There's still hope. There's a lot of pieces to it. I'm happy to give you the long, sorted details, but there's lots of pieces of it. It is not hopeless to think that it'll still be implemented. But frankly, the Houthis have just simply refused to date to agree to a couple of the basic premises which would free up the port there in Hodeidah.
And I agree that they are clearly much more at fault with respect to the implementation of the agreement. I just think we continue to be the only game in town with respect to the ability to bring the Saudis to the table and the ability to convince the Houthis that there will be an honest broker to make sure that the other side complies with the agreements that they make. Lastly, staying on Saudi Arabia, just a couple points of clarification. You are testifying that you believe the administration is in compliance with the Magnitsky Act because you are still gathering evidence. But the Magnitsky Act, which is a piece of legislation passed by Congress, signed by the President of the United States, doesn't give you the unlimited ability to gather evidence. In fact, it states very clearly that not later than 120 days after receiving a request from the chairperson and ranking member of the appropriate committee, you need to submit a response. And so how do you square this very clear requirement that you have to respond in 120 days with your contention that you have unlimited time to collect evidence?
So the State Department did submit a response. Indeed, I know I've submitted 2 responses.
Right, but the response has to determine if that person is engaged in the activity, not defer to a later point as to make that determination.
I think we've fully complied with the statutory requirement.
And lastly, on the 2 American citizens that are in custody, Salah al-Hader and Bader el-Ibrahim, these are new disclosures of dual citizens that have been imprisoned. These are journalists, intellectuals, activists. You mentioned that we can't, there has to be some response, but the only response you mentioned was asking about them with the Saudis. At some point when they don't answer our requests for release, would we expect some more consequential response from the administration? They're holding Americans prisoner for their political beliefs, and the medical reports out of these prisons suggest that there are some really awful things going on, deprivation of sleep, electrocution, malnourishment. What's the next step here?
So I'm happy to talk to you privately about the range of things that are under consideration. We take every American citizen who's wrongfully detained as a burden, as a duty, as something that we know we have the responsibility that weighs on us, and we work to achieve their release.
Asking is not the beginning and end of our policy.
We'll have lots of tools, lots of different ways to try and get those outcomes. We don't always succeed.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, and we're going to get you out here right at 4:30. So, Senator Van Hollen, I'll give you 3 minutes, and I'll take a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Just briefly on Saudi Arabia, with respect to the transfer of U.S. nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia. I gather you signed off on the Department of Energy's decision to provide the Part 810 authorizations. Is that right?
I did. We were part of that conversation.
Can you tell us when that was?
I'll get you the answer.
Record. Okay. As you know, Saudi Arabia has talked openly about acquiring a nuclear weapon, in addition to many of the sort of transgressions we've discussed today. As you know, the UAE adopted the gold standard. Would you agree that it should be our position that before we move forward with any kind of nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia, even if we made the decision that that was a wise move, that at the very least they should have the gold standard?
It's certainly been what we've been pursuing, right? It's what the administration's been trying to get. That's our goal.
I understand, Mr. Secretary, but you, of course, will be able to make the decision about whether that's an absolute condition or not, assuming people move forward on the merits. And I would hope it would be American policy to require that as a condition if the decision's made to move forward. Let me briefly just mention 2 bipartisan bills that have been introduced and ask if you could take a look at them and get back to us.
Yes, sir.
One is on, it's called the Brink Act. Senator Toomey and I introduced it. Is it your position, the administration's position, that as we continue negotiations with North Korea, we should maintain maximum economic pressure?
Yes.
Okay. Because there was some confusion, as you know, recently, because the president made a comment and maybe walked it back. But I'm glad to hear that answer, because that's exactly what the Brink Act would do. It would apply the same sanctions regime with respect to North Korea that we did with Iran, that helped bring Iran to the negotiating table, applying secondary sanctions. There was a report today about how China had, opened another crossing on the Yalu River with respect to trade, which obviously undermines the economic pressure. So I hope that you will join with us in that effort. The other measure is the Deter Act. I've introduced that with Senator Rubio. It's designed to make sure that we deter future Russian interference in our elections. Mm-hmm. And unlike other measures here, which are just adding new sanctions now, it's a prospective sanction. I think sanctions should be designed to try to influence behavior. And the idea is pretty simple. If we catch the Russians again interfering in our elections, they will face swift and severe sanctions. So if you're Putin trying to make that calculation going forward, you'll know you have a very heavy price to pay. We introduced it last year, but we're going to be reintroducing it. I think you were very supportive of the concept. Would you support going forward with something like that?
I would. I know the outlines of the Deter Act, and conceptually, I make it make sense.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you.
We got like 30 seconds. You've been great, by the way. Turkey, important ally, a lot of problems. Do you support increased economic integration between the American economy and Turkey?
I do.
When it comes to Afghanistan, can you assure this committee and the world that the Afghan government will be a meaningful participant in any peace deal?
More than that, they will be at the center of it. It will be Afghan-led.
Going to Italy and Tunisia next week, what should the message be about Libya?
So we've made clear our expectation that the political process there will be allowed to come to its fruition, and that there shouldn't be bloodshed and violence to resolve this, that there should be a political resolution there in Libya.
Well, thank you. You've done an excellent job as Secretary of State. I personally appreciate all the effort you put into your job, the counsel you've given the President, and appearing before the committee today. We have a statement from the Department of State's OIG. We'll introduce into the record. Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction will be made part of the record. Any questions the subcommittee would like to submit no later than Friday, April the 12th. Our next hearing will be on April 30th with USAID Administrator Mark Green. Subcommittee stands adjourned.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you.